This is the third series in the third year, indeed, of the Laureate of podcasts that I have made with some of my fellow writers, in which I ask what the hell stroke heaven it is that we do. Not expecting or even needing an answer, but in not getting an answer, maybe some signpost directions towards an answer. I really hope you enjoy them. Today, I am privileged, I'm delighted to talk to the very unusual, unique, magical Kevin Barry, or Brother Kev, as we call him in our monastery, our non-existent monastery. He is the author of The City of Bohan, Beetlebone, Night Boat to Tangier is his most recent novel, and two, I think, seminal books of short stories. There are Little Kingdoms and Dark Lies the Island. Where I'm asking as usual, what the hell heaven are we doing? We don't know what we're doing. At a certain level, we don't want to know what we're doing, but in failing to answer that question, I think, is the potential joy of asking the question. So today, we have an hour in this extraordinary golden company of Kevin Barry. So, beloved brother Kevin, together at last, if only with the entire country between us. I have actually made for you a delightful series of questions, because when you are talking to a close family member, you have to be careful what you say.
Have to be careful.
Yeah. My first question, therefore, and we may or may not stick with these, but is, and before I say the question, I'm so pleased you're doing this. My reverence for you is infinite, Kevin. First, the question is, I have a sense of your work as an almost physical entity. What is your thinking on sentences themselves? How do they seem to embody life itself at their best?
Yeah, I think that writing prose fiction, I think, like a lot of art forms, is a kind of it's kind of a disappointed musical form. You know, I think all of the other arts aspire to the condition of music, essentially. I tend to follow the sentences with the ear, line by line, and kind of try and find that kind of, some days, and it's often a day where you're not feeling particularly inspired, but you just write a sentence or half a paragraph and you hear that resounding kind of little ting, and it's like a tuning fork, and you go, now I have the fucking story here. This is it, and it's an oral thing. You get it with the ear more so. I always recall seeing an interview in the 1990s with Don DeLillo, when he said that he doesn't care much about the meaning in his sentences. All he's looking for is the music of them, what they sound like. He wants to write.
Robert Frost actually said that. He said, I pay only attention to the sound and let the sense look after itself, which sounds like a very dangerous thing. And yet, that is actually your only chance of making something decent for some reason.
Yeah, absolutely agree, and it is risky territory. When you're allowing this kind of music to take over and to dictate where the story is going to go. But it's absolutely the way I operate, I think.
If we had a proper brain expert, he could talk to us about where he thinks or she thinks this stuff is coming from. It's probably, in my view, not coming from the top bit where we were overeducated and stuffed with facts, but rising from some other part of the brain. And I presume before we were dignified, supposedly, with the name Homo sapiens sapiens, we were some other creature probably doing the same thing. So this may be embedded in us. We are taught to think of ourselves as individuals, but do you have any sense of the ancient commonality of writing, or the responsibility to hold the attention of the person at the fireside, maybe to keep the lions away, the fear of the lions out of
Yeah.
their head.
Well, I think it's always kind of lovely and mysterious to consider the fact that every human on the planet is a wonderful storyteller when they're dreaming. You know, we're such natural storytellers when we dream. All these scenes present themselves made out of memory and little flickers of consciousness. The dialogue is unimprovable. These inherent sort of
Yes.
narrative logic comes out of our dreams, and then we wake up and we can't do it. You know, it becomes such a slog to do it. I think this is why so many writers are morning writers. When you're still kind of puddled in that dream melt at the start of the day, that's when you can access that stuff in the unconscious, and that's where it comes from. Exactly as you say, it comes from the murky bits at the back. You know, the exact same place that our dreams come from, where you're working with memory, where you're working always, I guess, with the sense as well that life, as we get older, it becomes more evident that it hovers towards a condition of shapelessness, and that what we're trying to do when we write stories is we're trying to put narrative shape and sense on it. We're trying to make meaning out of what can appear in life itself to be almost meaningless. And it's a very fundamental and primal human need to do this.
And yet you have to respect its tendency towards chaos. It just needs to be on the cusp, the border between those two things. You can't neglect the fact that it wants to explode or exit. You know, it's always on the point of going away from you. Isn't that why it's quite a terrifying, really, in truth, undertaking to write a goddamn book? Because we don't know what it is. We don't really know what we're doing, but we know that it's something.
That's really interesting to talk about, the kind of wildness and chaos that's always kind of at the edge of it, because, and without kind of getting too technical with this too early, but I find it comes into my drafting process. I find I often, with a story, I will go a draft too far and it becomes too polished and too smooth. And what I tend to have to do to a text then is to go back in and kind of rough it up a bit and put awkward bits back in and put the elbows and the knuckles and the toes back into it and let that kind of wildness reign more, you know. There's a very old-fashioned phrase now where people would talk about a piece of writing in a negative way as having a whiff of the lamp off it, in that it was too studied and too worked. And that's I think that's in all writers, the tendency to keep cutting and polishing, because cutting is usually such a useful tool to find the shape of your story, but you can overdo it.
Maybe we're calling it the wrong thing when we say chaos, because really, you know, since we've all been baking bread, or at least I have, if you don't get the air into your bread, it's not bread. And in a way, what we're talking about is putting the air back into something so that it can actually have its proper substance. What is always, I mean, after 45 years, what's always been a bit worrying to me is the fact, like the people who made the fig rolls, you know, we make the fig rolls, but we don't know how to make them.
Yeah.
That's what's unnerving about it in a rather good way.
Yeah, I think as well.
Anyway, yeah.
But I think it was. I think I can never attribute quotes. I come across these quotes and they're fabulous. I can never remember who said them. I think it might have been Iris Murdoch who said that every time you write a novel, you start a new novel, you're jumping off a cliff and you have to invent a new rope as you go down. You know.
Yes.
And Hilary Mantel actually said writing one novel doesn't prepare you for the next one. A completely new set of problems present themselves every time as you try and get that sensation of life and air onto the page, you know. All you can do is read. All you can do is read the great writers. I mean, just last night in the bed, I went back to a very old and favorite writer of mine who was B.S. Pritchett, especially in the story form, you know. And it's weird. He was a writer I stayed away from for years because of his name, B.S. Pritchett. I thought these are going to be perfect English short stories like cucumber sandwiches, and it's nothing of the sort. It's really wild work that plays with voice and dialogue so much. Talking about that, getting the air and the kind of messiness of life on the page, Pritchett is superb at that.
Not a curious thing too, Kevin, that you know, I know for instance, for Colin McCann, he talks about Ben Kiley as an important person, and indeed, He was, and indeed to me, Ben Kiley got me into Ace-Donna, so I revere his memory. But I think for me, the instigator or the secret sharer, literally, of my work was just reading Conrad when I was in Paris, at the age of 22. And you've invoked V.S. Pritchard, which wouldn't be everybody's choice of instigator naturally.
Yeah.
But I know I've read Pritchard and I see exactly what you mean. I wonder what that is. Is that a kind of DNA thing when there's a certain writer who has prompted you?
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned your 20s, because I think that age, early 20s, when you're an absolute sponge for influence, and the brain is so capacious at that stage compared to what it is. Yeah.
Talk about chaos.
Yeah, and it's I think that's when the foundational stuff goes in terms of influence, the kind of influence that you never quite work away from. In my 20s, when I was starting to try and write fiction in a serious way, I was in Cork City at the time. I was reading a little too narrowly, was a difficulty. I was kind of obsessed with people like Pritchard, but especially with the great American Jews, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth. I decided I needed to write the next great Jewish American novel, essentially. It didn't work out, strangely enough. But it's odd, isn't it? Earlier on, I think, and maybe all the way through a writing career, the motion is kind of circular. You're kind of homing in all the time on your own fundamental stuff, your own fundamental material. You're getting a little bit closer to that all the time. And you kind of have to develop a thick skin to go at your real stuff that's going to really kind of get you your good work, and it takes a while, and you need to kind of read through all your influence and write through it.
You're trying to not only reach your own moon, but make your own moon.
Yeah.
But somebody needs to be back there in Cape Canaveral. So, if it's V.S. Pritchard, all the better. It's somehow a guide, a spirit guide, even you could say in Native American terms, to invoke another whole religious nexus. I remember even, it's not just the work, because I remember seeing Isaac Bashevis Singer in doing an event, as we so often used to have to do until the coronavirus. And his whole attitude, his easiness, his gentle gunslinger wit that he had towards his audience really inspired me. And I thought, if I could be like that with an audience, then that would be worth doing. I mean, how do you feel about events? That you're a beautiful reader, you do beautiful events, but you yourself, do you relish them? Are you up for it?
I do. I really enjoy them. And it was kind of a surprise to me that I would enjoy them, to be honest. I remember when my first book of stories came out with the Stinging Fly Press, with a small press in Dublin, and Declan Mead, the publisher there, literally had to push me, at the first read, go on, just go up and read from your fucking story, will you? And I went, God, I don't know if I'm going to be into this. And I got in front of the microphone and started reading and went, oh, I'm home. I love doing this. I really enjoy doing this. Yeah, you realize, I think, you realize that I think this would be particularly right in your own instance as well. I think that writers and actors are cousinly. I think they're closely related professions. There is an impulse to performance in writing as well, for sure. I'd like to hear your take on this. Do you edit as you read from your work in public? Do you find the editor kicking in, going, Jesus, I could have cut that sentence? Or
no, what I do is I have done that actually. And say, reading out of the Secret Scripture, if there's certain books I've brought to events that are full of crossings out, which I didn't think I needed for a reading, strangely enough. And that makes you wonder, well, did I really need it for the narrative? Interestingly enough, Dickens, who invented this public reading thing, and did it really literally till he burst with an apoplexy of some sort. He readied up scripts, as it were, for his readings, The Death of Nancy, whatever, and it's full of erasures and shortenings. And that's a very interesting, but I also, when I'm doing it, I'm praying, at a sense, that it would carry me, especially the first time. That there's something there, Kevin. You know.
Yeah, it's.
Have you,
I think every writer who does public readings always has the spectre of poor Dickens at the back of his mind keeling over on stage. You know?
dying, literally dying.
I do sometimes feel, and this is actually especially true if I'm writing a short story. I sometimes read back over a paragraph and go, "You're writing that to read it." You know, you're writing that paragraph to perform it,
well,
and then I think maybe that's not a bad thing. You know.
Well, I thought in recent times, not that it's a bad thing, but it might be a seducing thing. It might be a sort of, it might be in the realm not of love and marriage, but of unfaithfulness, where you're doing something to serve yourself, which is actually sort of jimmying up the text to give it a better bang. And I actually, when I was starting to write Days Without End, which is the book before last, I made certain rules for myself, which was no poetry, no set pieces, you know, so that I couldn't read it in public. Yeah. Basically, that was my rule, so that I would go the other extreme. Right. For that very concern, actually, that there might be a sort of menace in that, and that the text would forevermore, I mean, more than likely, all we've done will die a death anyway, but if any of it survives, that it would bear the traces of this this performance thing.
I read quite a cruel snippet. I was reading John Cheever's letters recently, and he talked about being on a reading tour with Updike in the late '60s in Russia or something. And out of the side of his mouth, to someone, Cheever said, "I can't stand the sight of that child jumping up and down and performing on the page." You know, but it's I think pragmatically, I guess, in terms of what you put down and what you take away on the page, I'm very influenced by the fact that I work in different forms, that I'm writing scripts and stuff a lot of the time now. And when I go back to writing prose fiction, definitely there's an impatience with some of the traditional kind of scenery painting that you're expected to do in kind of prose fiction. And my inclination increasingly is to kind of remove the scaffolding as much as I can. And it's kind of the fun of it as well, in a fundamental way. You know, when you're writing a story, you're building a little machine as well. And if I take this away, it's still standing and it's still operating. And
for lightness' sake, do you leave your work behind, or do you carry it with you? As I know you have to perform them, but do you bring your work with you, or do you try and leave it in your wake? Which can be very difficult when.
I mean, I don't typically reread myself. I don't sit down for a nice evening of me, you know, in front of the fire. But I you know, often you will go to like a university or something, and they'll ask you to read something that you wrote years and years ago.
Years ago, yeah.
And I had the experience last year in the US of, God bless them, in some university they were looking at City of Bohan, my first novel, which I wrote around 2009. You know, so, and it's a very strange experience going back to read your work from even just over a decade ago, because it's kind of like visiting a ghost of yourself. You know, you're a different person. I mean, you know, there's nothing mysterious about prose style. It's your personality projected very directly on the page, and you're changing all the time as a person, you know. So the work, it shows up very clearly in your prose style, and it can kind of be strange to go back and look at it. And of course, you look at it with a more practiced eye, and you think, well, I would do that differently. I would improve that. Certainly, I could see a great youthful vitality, but it was kind of lots that I would do different now.
Yes, but you know, the truth is, Kevin, if you went back in to bring what you are now, you know, that you'd wreck that work.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
The creature it is. And I wanted to ask you, actually, turning that you mentioned the word child there with Don DeLillo. Oh no, who was it?
Cheever on Updike. Yeah.
Cheever, yeah. Do you think that, I mean, I think, and I'm wondering, do you think that all your best research is done, you know, maybe age 2 to 10, when your brain is even more clear, and this lie that the child is somehow unformed because the child sees everything, remembers everything? Do you feel that there was stuff going on?
That's a great question, because I think in terms of writing, or making pictures or songs or whatever it is you're doing creatively, it's essentially play. There's something essentially childlike in it, and I think it's very important for all artists to try and stay in touch with that kind of pure sense of play, and try and remind yourself all the time. I try to remind myself all the time when I'm at the desk, you should be having a fucking good time. You know, by the glories of whatever powers are out there, you're not digging the roads and you're not down a coal mine. You're getting to sit in your shed by the stove in County Sligo and make up little worlds and situations and characters. And so it's a great privilege to be able to do that. So I should be having a good time. I always think of that movie kind of biopic version of the writer's life, where the tortured genius is pacing up and down and balling up the pages and throwing them at the waste paper basket. I think I don't want to read that stuff either. Please throw it in the bin. I always think it's a very simple, direct equation. If I'm not having a good time at this end of the process, beloved reader isn't having a good time at the far end of the process.
And you know, it doesn't mean, absolutely, and it doesn't mean that, you know, it doesn't mean you can't be having a terrible time in your life. You could still need to access that child. I'm thinking of Joseph Roth rather than Philip Roth, who had a ferocious life as far as one can tell, and yet kept that sense of buoyancy in his work. I'm just wondering also, because I'm actually asking you questions that come out of my own sense of being alive. I had a rather glorious and complicated and probably ultimately self-absorbed mother, who nevertheless put a pencil in my hand when I was 9 and said, well, paint or write, do what you like, but one or the other, you know, this was her instruction, apparently. I don't know anything about your background, even though we're brothers. Strangely, you'd think I would know. But did your mother, thinking of the African experience where the mother is often the teller of stories to a child, did she have an importance in that sense, your own mother?
Well, it's a very interesting thing. My mother died when I was young, when I was 10. Yeah, and it's really interesting if you look at biographies of writers and artists. It's very, very common, the early death of a parent. It seems to create some sort of need to create in response to this kind of early view of the void. You see it in so many writers, you know. Irish writers, Colm Tóibín, Bellow lost a mother very young. It's a very common thing. It's interesting if I think of my family life, whether any kind of creative or literary impulse, whether it came from a male, from the mother or the father's side, it's very hard to say. We weren't, you know, an artistic family in any way. It was a house of readers, absolutely, but there was no artistic bar kind of singing in pubs kind of thing, you know. But there wouldn't have been any sort of creative work done. I'm inclined to, when I think about my family background, if one of my parents had that kind of any kind of literary impulse, it would have been possibly more likely my father, you know. But he would have been, you know, a fellow who born in the 20s in Limerick, working class background, worked in CIE and stuff, and would never have had the ambition really to go in that direction. Like, it was very interesting to me when I was writing that first novel, City of Bohan, which, even though it was set in an imaginary future, is really about using the language of working class parts of Limerick and city where I grew up. And it was amazing to me that language hadn't really shown up in Irish literature very much, you know, and not for any particular sinister reason. It's just that those communities weren't in the way of producing literary fiction. And here I think, like, example is very important. Like, when I was a teenager in Limerick in the 80s, there was one novelist in town, you know, the late Michael Curtin, as in a novelist who was producing in a serious way and work that was been published abroad and stuff. So when there's only one guy doing it in town, it seems like an unlikely kind of line to pursue. It would be different if you grew up in New York or in London, you know, where there's writers everywhere. It's a common thing. So it takes a while then to develop the confidence to say, actually, I need to do that and I need to have a go. But it's definitely, I mean, it all comes from what goes on and I was talking about that circular motion earlier on, where you're homing in on your kind of fundamental stuff, and really that's family stuff. And I think there's a very interesting thing that happens when emerging writers read back over their work. They will come on some couple of sentences and they will recoil in horror and embarrassment from the page and immediately cut those sentences. And I always say,
Yeah.
cut everything else. Just leave the stuff that really embarrasses you, because that's the
Yeah.
good stuff. That's where you're
Yeah.
getting into your fundamental kind of zone. And I bet that
Yeah.
stuff is about families material, you know. Obviously, you've had no great reluctance to write about family material.
Well, the reason it's a strange, I mean, I have had a reluctance. I've had a reluctance about almost everything. And what my reluctance, you talked about your father not being particularly maybe tending towards writing, but he sounds to me like he was a positively charged individual. This to me now is what is the crucial thing. Is the person whose company you're in, are they positively charged or negatively charged? I would say my own father was negatively charged. So in a sense, that's a loss. So what you're doing is exactly what you described, maybe with the death of your mother, is that there has been an explosion and you need to restore the world. You need to reverse time, put everything back in its place.
Yeah.
And that's the hopeless, impossible impulse, you might say. But a child never allows things to be hopeless. He will always, or she will always continue to try and do that. I have written really about people who, in the whispers of families, have had a brief spark of life. Somebody who has been put away in an asylum for something, but would only survive as 6 words. So I'm giving them 300 pages for the 6 words. If I know too much about them, then I'm lost. But if your father is there, that means that if you had him, if it was physics, he would be a positive charge in the equation. That's the important thing. Were there people in your childhood that were negatively charged, maybe, that were a menace to you in any way, or were the people, because you do write about menace in a very loving way, almost.
I can't say that there were specifically. I think what's very important for all people who are going to try and become some kind of artist later on in life, I think your teenage cohorts are very important. I think the set you make yourself a part of in that kind of early kind of teenage years. And I absolutely fell in with the kind of the arty kids at school, you know, and we would go and see the kind of French movies at the art center on Sunday night and things like that, and we would be quite sniffy kind of kids, you know, that kind of pretentious kind of thing. Very important phase to go through, you know. I think as well, like it's almost a cliche thing, but I think any writer you talk to has had inspirational English teachers at school. I certainly had a couple of them who were very important, especially in terms of getting me into there was a Mr. Lynch at Sexton Street, Eric Lynch, who got me into poetry, you know.
God bless.
Yeah, got me into Jared Manley Hopkins, you know, which is something you never really recover from, you know. I'm actually talking as we kind of tiptoe into poetry. We should talk a little bit about the lyric impulse. You know, we both have it in our work, in to large degrees and in different ways, maybe. But is it a specific thing, do you think, with Irish writers that we can't quite get away from that lyric impulse?
Well, you know, when they say, sometimes when people are talking about an extrovert, ebullient person, and they say, oh, you know, his great charm, or she's great charm, very charming and wonderful. And then you realize actually they're not willing to spend more than 10 minutes with that person. You know, that actually it's an impossibility to spend any length of time with them. The lyric impulse in Irish, in English, Irish, as it were, there is also a sense of explosion somewhere, isn't there? And loss and restoration, trying to put something back. Sometimes I think it's a kind of beautiful wickedness in that we're refusing to allow English to be English. We want it to be a different language, and we're making it a different language. And we're also using the sort of seeing that's so blatant in old Irish poetry, where they're trying to not only describe something, but actually reproduce it on the page in a sort of kit, the kit of a blackbird or whatever. There's something about trying to reconstruct again something that is quite destroyed. I mean, we can't. I mean, it is easy to talk about the loss of Irish in the 19th century as if it's not important, but it has to be important because we're not speaking our Hebrew, as it were. You know, we never did that. My grandfather's, that was one of his great regrets, that he went through the revolution and we didn't end up speaking Irish in this country.
Yeah. I mean, and it's kind of, you know, it's very hard to explain in some ways, the lyric impulse, but it has to be connected with the fact of that underlay of the Irish language in the way that we twist and bend and kind of beautifully mangle the English as we use it. I mean, I do find the way in which I kind of go off on a kind of a lyrical note in my work is definitely changing. Earlier on, if I had a kind of a lyric kind of passage or a couple of sentences, I would try to immediately barb it thereafter with some sort of a kind of wry, sardonic kind of line to show that I'm kind of aware of it and I'm kind of taking the piss out of it. It's having your cake and eating it, really, you know. I'm less inclined to do that now. I find that the barb is less important now, and just to kind of go with it. I mean, lyricism does take you out towards the edge of the cliff. You know, it's a dangerous place to operate. You know, but I'm really interested in those edge kind of places out in the cusp.
And you spoke earlier of a sort of humiliation of the writer when they read something that gives them pause. And I think that's terribly important. When we were trying to be a member of groups when we were young, I mean, I was often falling off the cliff with that.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you've got to put the knapsack on your back that you actually own and be yourself and be kind of semi-disastrous. But one of the, I mean, I've been working for about 45 years, maybe I was 22 when I came down from Trinity. And I certainly didn't get anywhere till I was 40. So, but I mean, I published books, but I know that they weren't right now. But what age do you feel? I mean, was there a moment you recognized along the way where you thought, oh, this feels like Barrytown. This feels like the edge of.
Yeah, I could put a date on it almost.
A date on it. Oh, wow.
Almost, yeah. I like in I think late 90s, in the summer of 1999. I'd been trying to write bits of stories and stuff, but I finally said, you know, I have to get poor for a while and give up a lot of the freelance journalism commitments I had at the time. And I went and I lived in a caravan out in the Beara Peninsula for 3 months and wrote a really fucking terrible novel, like an awful thing, you know, where I was trying to be Cork's answer to Saul Bellow, and it wasn't working out at all.
Yes.
But I remember towards the end of that summer, out in Allihies and the Beara Peninsula, going for a walk one afternoon, knowing that the novel I'd kind of cobbled together wasn't even going to be sent out the door. I knew myself full well that it wasn't good enough. But I remember kind of crouching down and looking out over the Atlantic and saying to myself, and I was so in earnest, I'd say my lips were actually moving. I said to myself, are you serious? You know, are you serious about this? Are you actually going to do it? And I remember saying, absolutely. I'm absolutely going to fucking do this. I'm going to put the work in. Like, I knew that I had the ability, and what I needed to develop was the discipline. I mean, literary ability, the strange thing about it, literary talent, is it's not rare. There's a lot of it around. A lot of people can write well and can write stories and come up with characters. What's rare is the discipline, that sort of doggedness that would make you go into the room every day of the week when you don't feel like doing it, when you'd rather be doing anything else. And that, in cohort with the native or natural talent, is what makes a writer. And I had to develop the second bit. I had to develop the discipline. But I remember vividly that day in August 99, sitting, looking out over the water and going, I'm going to do it. And you have to kind of declare it to yourself in some way, you know? And
crucially, in a very wild place.
Absolutely, yeah. And on the edge of the Atlantic, and the sea impinges on my work so much, you know, and it's kind of... It's a fundamental to it, but it's you have to. I mean, it sounds slightly esoteric, but when you say, "I'm going to write," be it poems or songs or stories or whatever it is, what you're doing is you're making a pact with your own unconscious. You're saying, "Give me stuff, give me the material, Let it come true, and let me be able to kind of get out of the way of it a bit, and make the work from it. So it's important to make these kind of strange kind of ritual declarations. I found it was very important in my 20s to tell people I was doing it, to kind of come out about it and say, actually, I'm writing a novel. And it's awful, because I'd be wandering around Cork in the 90s, and people would come up to you embarrassedly going, so how's the novel going? And you're going, which one was I telling you about? Because you've had 4 on the go since. But it's important in some way to declare it, and say, I'm doing this.
First thing you feel then embodied, met that declaration?
Actually, very quickly afterwards, around the turn of the millennium, I started to write some short stories, and I was looking down at them going, that's actually my kind of natural kind of humor was coming onto the page. The work was getting funny, which it hadn't been when I was trying to write the Saul Bellow novels. You know what I mean? And it was as I kind of started to write closer to home as well, as I started to set stories in Cork and in Limerick and places that I knew well, where I wasn't trying to be, something else. The kind of any kind of effervescence that I had in my own personality was starting to get onto the page then. But yeah, it takes a while. There's no shortcut to it,
That's your own bird song. You see, you say, lots of people can write, and I'm sure that's true, but and they do, but to me, I don't mind failing as a writer if I could finally reach the point where I felt that my true birdsong had been finally sung. Even if it's the song of a robin rather than of a great hawk. And I do think that's rare enough. I think it's rare in the sense that it should be rare. I'm thinking of when you open Thomas Hardy, you're with Thomas Hardy as soon as you read those sentences. Or Joseph Conrad is exactly the same, or you're the same. And I do think I think it's very rare, and I think it has to be snuck up on. And if you think about it, Conrad sneaked up or snuck up on his work by even coming through another language to reach it. He had to go through a whole career as a master sailor before he started to write it when he was 30. He was creeping up on something that he thought he could do. Most unlikely that he would be that.
It's amazing, yeah. I mean, you come at it kind of crabwise, and sidelong often. I mean, the first things that kind of started to sound like me on the page were, in a sense, very traditional Irish short stories, which in my kind of sniffy kind of 20-something days in Cork would have been the last thing on the planet I would imagine myself writing. But it was when I found myself in a certain mode, writing pretty traditional short stories that had epiphanous finishes and the whole lot. That's when it started to come true. It's someone called it. I think Norman Mailer wrote a book about writing called The Spooky Art, and it's absolutely a great description. There's so much about it is mysterious, and the more you do it, the more mysterious it gets. The closer you get to it, the less you know about it.
Which is why I even instigated this crazy series of podcasts, because I know there's no answer to the question what the hell are we doing? What the heaven are we doing? There is no answer, but it's in not reaching an answer is the important thing to me. I mean, both of us, mistakenly or not, over the years have received our fair share, you might say, of praise and approbation. What does that mean? Do you regard that as a menace, or do you feel it as a cheering on, or you just ignore it? Do you read your reviews, for instance?
I when I was in my 20s and I would read someone like Mr. Banville saying, "Oh, I never look at the reviews." I would think, "Oh, come on, the fuck! Of course you read your reviews." And now, actually, I when your first book comes out, you're like waiting outside the newsagents for the newspapers to appear, and you're picking up the newspaper, and you can recite them by heart. At this point, I kind of glance and kind of speed read through, and I get the gist of whether it's broadly negative or broadly positive. I find that the good ones, the raves, are probably more dangerous for you than the hatchet jobs. You know,
Yes.
it's important to believe neither, of course, but it's difficult. I can't say I ignore them, but it's probably true to say that I pay less attention than I used to. The most important thing, I think, is when you're writing, to keep your attention to within the peripheries of the desk, not to wonder about what's going to happen when it goes out into the world.
Yeah, and all those things are, sadly, you might say, an intrusion. Isn't it also because you've tried to preserve, literally, not the childishness of the child, but the integrity of the child. And as we know, when you're a child, too much praise, too much censure, it really derails the child. And you want to keep your little caboose on the tracks, don't you? And you need to be enclosed. And it's very difficult, and it's a challenge. And I was trying to talk to my students about this. How do you survive being told you've done it well? I mean, do you feel that you have a better chance of writing a good book after being a little bit bashed up, which you probably never experienced, or is it when you've been cheered on? Do you feel somehow? Do you miss a heartbeat? You know?
Yeah, it's like it's. I think what I try to do, and it's impossible to do fully, is I literally try to keep my writing career separate from. I try to keep the writing separate from career, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
Because I think if you start to think in career terms as you're writing your story, you will start to, at some way, you will start to write to please, you know, and that's creative debt on the page. You have to let it go in the unwieldy kind of directions it wants to go, and keep the kind of wildness and the awkwardness into it. I don't know. At the same time, you know, I was talking to Pat McCabe once about this, and he said something very true. He said, we are all writing with an audience in mind at some level. If you weren't, you just go and take the pages and ball them up and throw them off a cliff. You know what I mean? You do want it to go out into the world and be read.
We are the first generation, in a way, who's had unusual access to the thoughts and minds of our readers on sites like Goodreads, where, you know, thousands of people are reading your book and rating it, and probably speaking mostly 90% of the time with great honesty about what how they really responded. I mean, is that useful maybe more than criticism?
And like everyone's a critic now. Everyone who can pick up a biro is now a critic. But I have very mixed feelings about what technology and the internet and social media has done for literature. I mean, for writers, in some ways, I think it's disastrous, because it's such a kind of a distraction. And my big rule is I don't go online in the morning. I keep that kind of sacred. But at the same time, my first book was 2007, just as the whole sort of online kind of literary community kind of thing starts to come together, and it's been hugely beneficial for me in terms of getting my work around and attracting new readers to it. I can't say I've never glanced at my Goodreads reviews either. I certainly have, but it's again just trying to keep that stuff out of your mind, really, when you sit down and begin the new thing.
Because we break our good rules doesn't mean, you know, we don't break them. We break them anyway. That's it. In a way, I do feel there's a sense of it with a writer that one likes, that's important, that you've always known them. And of course, Einstein would say that's quite accurate. We have always been here, and all our moments are eternal, and we only have a sense of moving up through time. And in a way, novel writing is to try and prove that you can literally go back and recover an actual lump of time that seems to be the past, but actually you can access it in real time with this writerly brain. But in your case, it's almost literal, because the first song my great aunt Annie taught me, and strangely enough, she was the daughter of the chief superintendent of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. So, but thing was, Kevin Barry had gone to school in Rathvilly with one of her father's cousins. So that was more important. The local thing was more important than the politics.
Yeah.
Can you sing the song, Kevin Barry?
I could give a rendition now, but I'm not going to. It's very interesting to think about my name in terms of there's as you'd imagine, a string of Kevin Barrys going back through the family.
Yes.
Yeah, so like I was named for a cousin who had sadly got killed off his scooter. He was like a mod in East Anglia in the 60s and came off his scooter. And I was born like a year to the day later, so I was named for that cousin. And his dad had been Kevin Barry, who fought in the Second World War. And it was Kevin Barry's. I presume the original impulse was a Republican one in the family. I don't know. But it's strange. It's definitely a little bit of baggage I carry with me, especially in terms of when I go to America and stuff, and the Irish Americans show up. But it's
that's great. And what did he do in the Second World War?
Great story actually. He was a great guy. My late uncle Kevin. He went to Italy, was captured inside half an hour. He loved to recall, and spent a wonderful 3 years in an Italian village chasing women and eating very well and drinking wine, and came back a hero. So he had a great experience of the war, which he loved to recall.
Did he volunteer, or was he? What do you know?
I guess so. I think he moved to England he was a bit older than my dad. He moved to England, worked in the shipbuilding yards in Great Yarmouth in the 1930s, and I guess just signed up then, but
these are ostensibly non-Republican histories, but it's what we have. It's who we are.
Yeah.
We're the sum of all these decisions. I mean, the other magical name in Ireland is Michael Collins, and as we know, one of the Michael Collinses went to the moon. So we haven't had a Kevin Barry on the moon yet, unless you're an instance of creating a moon.
Yeah.
Anyway, the first line of the song, because I just want to invoke my great aunt. In Mountjoy jail one Monday morning, high upon the gallows tree, Kevin Barry gave his young life for the cause of liberty. And she'd put me up on the chair.
I should really come in and Beach Boys harmonies with you now. I'm not going to.
Yes, just for the sake of history, Kevin, you could try.
Not at all.
No, okay. Right. Well, that's Kevin Barry out of the way. We're nearly near the end of this, but sadly, I wanted to ask you an odd question. Well, two odd questions in a way. First of all, I do hope, like Edna O'Brien, you're intending to write till you're 90. That would be
absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's so important for your physical vitality. I think for a writer to be always writing. And as you get older, you realize you really have to look after yourself to do it. It's in a weird way, it's hard physical work. When you're at that desk, you're often quite tensed, and try. I find it's very important to kind of look after myself and to try and stay fit and try and be to be able.
Are you a runner or a walker? Or?
I'm a swimmer more than anything, I guess. I go out on the bike a lot as well, but I swim. I've been swimming this year early because we've been around all the time. So I've been in Loch Arrow since kind of early April, and I'll be in Ross's Point inside half an hour after this is finished. I'll be going up to swim at Ross's today. But it's just that lovely thing. I love the water. It's that feeling of, it's like resetting your computer, when it's like turning it on and off again. You just feel kind of refreshed when you come out. And also, I think like so many writers, walking.
Yeah.
So critically important. Walking is like, there's something something like sentence making in walking.
Where you are. I mean, I have a huge anxiety about working. We've been here for 20 years. This is a little rector's study, really. It's just a tiny little room in the house, and this is where I've written most of these novels. And I do have an anxiety about being away or somewhere else, and I don't write anywhere else. Is your house important that you've made an old barracks into a house?
Yeah.
Is that important to you? And are all the physical things around you, weather and birds and hares, and are they your accomplices, do you think, in your work?
Yeah, I mean, this would have been the day room, the sergeant's day room in an
Wow.
RIC barracks in South County Sligo. It's I'm pretty fluent. I can generally write anywhere, and if I'm traveling around promoting a book or something, I'll always have a notebook and I'll be keeping things going. But absolutely, I write better here, and
Mm.
it's nice to be surrounded by your kind of talismans, and like a lot of writers, I don't keep very many books in my workroom, but I have sort of sacred texts that are close enough to the desk always. There would be a Pritchett book, there would be a Flannery O'Connor book and stuff like that.
And I've
But
met
it's,
your amazing partner. Does she read your work first, or is there that?
yeah, Olivia, who's upstairs at the moment, working on our winter papers. Olivia and my agent Lucy are the first readers, and they'll never say something is terrible, but I can tell by their eyes. I can tell by their eyes if they really like it. If there's a special little shine in the eyes, I know. So yeah, they're my first kind of line of defense if I'm trying to figure out have I finally gone completely fucking bonkers or is this okay? So that they're pretty honest with me.
Do you
It's
know?
interesting. I was never in because bit older than a lot of the writers coming out now. I was never in that kind of writers workshop group
No,
kind
me
of
neither.
thing. I never had that, so it's very different now. I think with writers you see emerging now that they're much more inclined. They will have very close kind of circles of friends that they'll share the work with. I never had that. The first time I set foot in a writer's workshop, I was giving it, which was kind of funny. But it's yeah, I came from
Have you ever written an entire novel that you've had to put aside?
oh, three of them.
Wow.
Um, I attempted three before I published one,
Right.
before the first one was published. Two of them I
Yeah.
knew that they were never going outside the door. They're
Yeah.
upstairs under the bed. I couldn't bear to
With
open the
Olivia.
boxes. I couldn't
You're
bear to
making
look
sure
them.
you're not letting them out.
Yeah, I think guarding them upstairs. Um, there was a third novel which was getting somewhere, which I went out and tried to find a publisher and got very encouraging kind of rejections in that way. And it's at that
Yeah.
point you're a pro really when you say fuck it, I'll write another one.
Oh,
You
yeah,
you
absolutely.
you realize at that stage that you have that kind of dogged streak that's so necessary for it.
It's worth more to you to put it aside than it is
Yeah,
to.
it absolutely. I often find as well that there's a weird thing. I get this with short stories a lot. When you're writing one and there's a kind of a phantom story underneath, that's the one you should really be writing, you know?
Oh,
And almost the trick of it is to figure out, I hate
oh,
using phrases like the trick of it, but the
yeah.
trick of it is to figure out what's the story that should be on my desk right now, you know?
Oh, God, that's a huge thought, Kevin. You've
Yeah.
given me a new thought. I'm going to have to think about that for, well, 25 years, and then I'll be 90 myself. So I want to read this just a moment. This is an odd question, but it's, as you can see, genuinely phrased. When I met you, this is when we had dinner together, I was impressed by your candor, your openness, and your gentleness, and you seemed to me democratic, even-keeled, and even joyous. I may be wrong. If you had to give a character of yourself in court, since you're in the day room, well, what might you say? If you had to defend yourself, how would you describe yourself, do you think?
Um, you know, I do have, I think, and it's kind of an amazement to me always, but I'm generally kind of in good form. I write a lot of work that can be very melancholy and it can have lots of kind of menace and stuff, like you pointed out in it. But generally,
Mm.
I'm quite effervescent. It's not like I leap out of bed with the joys of life, but generally, I'm in good enough form as I go along, and I think that's. And I try to get that into the work. I try to get any vitality I sense within myself onto the page, and it feeds both ways. If you're writing well, you're living well. I think what I aim for, or what I don't always manage, but I think is to have no real separation between the living and the working. That the writing shouldn't feel like this kind of
Mm.
chore. That I should feel as happy in there as I am generally, kind of mooching around the place. Um,
You've been very generous and a great inspiration to the writers coming up, as it were. I mean, this phrase "coming up" as if it was a natural thing and not what it is, in fact, miraculous. And I think a lot of writers look to you as a sort of benign instigator, you know, almost as if you're already,
I'm going to get that tattooed here,
yeah,
the
yeah,
benignance.
like you're already dead. Unfortunately, that sounds like no, you're the Conrad to a lot of people. I mean, journalists do ask the question: how come Ireland has so many, not just good writers, but fabulous writers at the moment?
Yeah.
Um, it's a great cause. I find that a great inspiration. I don't know how you feel about it. Obviously, you feel it's a positive thing, but um, do you
Yeah.
mind that, or
Do you know what it is? It goes back, I think, to something we said a while ago about example. You know, like when I was in Limerick in the 80s, there was one novelist. Now there's so many, not just good writers, but writers producing work that really, it's a small island that's really at a world class level,
yeah,
and it's a great thing. It's a great thing for all the others because it acts as both an inspiration and an example, but also as a goad, because you go to
yeah,
your desk and you think, Jesus, I better bring my A game, I better bring my
yeah.
best to this. So it's a fantastic thing. I try to never have any narrowly kind of nationalistic feelings, but I do feel kind of
No, but
pride when I see
we can
really
have
really good Irish
tribal
writers.
feeling about
Yeah,
it. I mean, just as Laureate, I've been trying to, talk to various people about the economies of writers, and when you consider truly exceptional writers, I mean, let's not even be so crass as to call them great, but they probably are, like Danielle McLaughlin and Nicole Flattery.
absolutely. Yeah,
And these are people who've spent 15, 20 years getting closer, as you described it, to what they can do, and then doing it. And then they produce a book that probably is for the ages. And yet, how are governments supposed to support that person? They produce this work. They probably get 5,000-10,000 quid for it.
yeah.
These are not living wages. And yet, it's a very difficult thought for ministers of finance
Yeah,
to
it
realize
is.
that.
It seems like something esoteric, in government circles, and certainly, while there are supports in Ireland, that there aren't enough, and when we're very low down the European tables and so forth, as we
Very
know.
low.
I mean, you need to have a canniness as well. You need to figure out how you're going to do it. I mean, I read a great piece of writing advice from Annie Dillard, the great American essayist. Once she said, "All you need to know about a writing life is just keep your overheads low." And it's a reason why I live in South County Sligo. That the housing relative to cities is very cheap. It's a small mortgage to live here. Because I live in rural Ireland, it means I don't have to do anything else. I don't have to teach or anything else. I can just go to my shed
Yes.
and write. That's a
Because
great privilege.
as,
Yeah.
as we've both, it is, and as we've both said on different occasions, what is your major advice to writers? And we've both said, oddly enough, on separate occasions, just keep going.
Just do it.
And in
Yeah.
order to keep going, really doing your work, you're right, you have to find the sixpence that bears a direct relation to how you're living. And
Yeah.
that's terribly important. But for a lot of writers, especially in this time, a lot of writers do pick up their few bob from events and teaching. And there must be at this moment a great deal of distress and sense of emergency among so
I,
many of our fellow
Yeah,
writers.
I think so, and it's worrying in some ways. I think, for example, for our cities, especially for our capital city, for Dublin, young writers and emerging writers can't afford to live there. And this is bad news for the writers, but it's even worse news for the city. Because it's losing
Yeah.
its creative people. It's great for places like this. There are so many writers dotted around County Sligo now and around rural Ireland generally. It's great, and you're bringing older places that have suffered a lot, bringing them back to life in some way by seeing sort of creative people set up here, realizing, what, this is a pretty good place to live. It's relatively inexpensive to live compared with the cities. So it's, but of course it affects the work then as well. It affects the work you turn out, it seems like a pragmatic
Yes.
decision in your life, where am I going to live? But it's going to influence very much what's coming out on the page as well. So it's the most important thing I think any new or emerging writer faces now, is the decision: where am I going to base myself? How am I going to do this?
Yes.
Back in the glorious day when you'd go to Paris and find your garret. Good luck with that now. You'd have to work 15 jobs to be able to pay for it. So it's
well, even when I was there in 1979, it was a ridiculous thing to do because Paris was much too expensive. I then had the good sense to go to Greece just before, and that before the EC, and that was cheap. that was cheap. Anyway, I mean, these are hugely important things, and I think even to think positively charged thoughts directed towards these the great undertaking of having a writing life. I mean, it is, you say it's a privilege, but it's also, there's also a sort of epicality to it, Kevin, which in my opinion, you embody. And it's not that I just want to thank you for doing this podcast. It's been one of the joys of my life to do it, because I admire you so much and I owe you so much. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
And you even sang to me. So what more can we say?
That's the full expression of my love, singing badly.
Okay, I'll never call you granduncle again. It's going to be brother from now on. It's going to be brother. Thank you, Sebastian. It was a joy.